My husband left his entire empire to me. My stepson sued, claiming I was an uneducated housewife who manipulated a dying man. He hired the city's most ruthless attorney to destroy me. As I entered the mahogany courtroom, the opposing counsel turned pale, dropped his leather briefcase, and bowed his head. "It's really you. I can't believe it." My stepson had no idea who I truly was. "I'm grateful you're here. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my truth has traveled." My name is Elena. I'm 67 years old, and today I learned what it feels like to be called just a housewife in a courtroom full of strangers. The morning began like any other since Marcus's death 6 months ago. I brewed my coffee in the same ceramic mug he'd gifted me for our 15th anniversary. I sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared 20 years of breakfasts, trying to pretend the silence didn't suffocate me. The house felt too vast now, too quiet, filled with memories that both comforted and tormented me. Then the doorbell rang. The young man in the ill-fitting suit handed me an envelope with the kind of formal politeness that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Mrs. Vance, legal documents. You'll need to sign here." My hands trembled as I read the papers. Derek, my stepson, was contesting Marcus's will. According to the documents, I had manipulated his father into leaving me everything. The words undue influence leapt off the page like accusations. Gold digger, opportunist, took advantage of an elderly man's diminished capacity. I sank into Marcus's old leather chair, the one where he used to read his evening newspaper, and felt the world shift beneath my feet. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of caring for this family, and this was how it ended. The courthouse smelled of old wood polish and broken dreams. I walked through those marble hallways in my simple navy dress, the same one I'd worn to Marcus's funeral, clutching my small purse like a lifeline. Every step echoed in the vast space, making me feel smaller and more insignificant with each sound. Derek was already there when I arrived, sitting at a polished mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars. He wore a charcoal suit that screamed money, his dark hair slicked back, and that familiar smirk I'd grown to despise over the years. Next to him sat his lawyer, James Whitmore, whose reputation preceded him like a warning sign. For $100 an hour, people whispered. The best money can buy. I had no lawyer. I couldn't afford one. Not without dipping into the inheritance Derek was trying to steal from me. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and Judge Morrison entered the courtroom. He was younger than I expected, maybe 55, with graying temples and the kind of serious expression that comes from years of listening to people's worst moments. The proceedings began with James Whitmore's opening statement. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind that could make lies sound like gospel truth. "Your Honor, we are here today because an innocent man's final wishes have been perverted by a calculating woman who saw opportunity in an aging widower's loneliness." I felt the blood drain from my face. Around me, the few spectators in the courtroom murmured their disapproval. Whitmore continued, painting me as a predator who'd swooped in to steal from Marcus's real family. "Mrs. Vance," he said, my name dripping with disdain, married the deceased after a suspiciously brief courtship. She has no children of her own, no career to speak of, no independent source of income. She was, by all accounts, nothing more than a housewife entirely dependent on my client's father for financial support. Derek leaned back in his chair with that same arrogant expression he'd worn since he was 12 years old. And I'd first married his father. I remembered trying to bond with him then, making his favorite pancakes on Saturday mornings, helping with homework he didn't want help with, attending school plays where he pretended not to see me in the audience. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, Mrs. Vance isolated the deceased from his son, poisoning their relationship and ensuring her position as sole beneficiary of an estate worth $9.2 million. The number hung in the air like an accusation. I'd never thought of Marcus's money as mine. It was just there, like the air we breathed, the foundation that allowed us to live comfortably while I took care of him, of our home, of the life we'd built together. Judge Morrison leaned forward. "And what evidence do you have of this alleged manipulation, Mr. Whitmore?" We have documentation showing that Mrs. Vance actively discouraged my client from visiting his father during the final years of his life. Phone records, witness statements from neighbors who observed her controlling behavior. I wanted to stand up and scream. Those discouraged visits were because Derek only came around when he needed money. Those phone records showed me trying to reach Derek when his father was dying, begging him to come home one last time. But how do you prove love? How do you demonstrate 20 years of caring for someone in a language the law understands? Mrs. Vance, Whitmore gestured toward me dismissively. Your Honor, we're dealing with a classic case of elder abuse. A woman with no marketable skills, no education beyond high school, who latched on to a vulnerable man and systematically turned him against his only child. That's when Derek spoke for the first time. She's just a housewife, he laughed, the sound echoing off the courtroom walls like a slap. Your Honor, look at her. She can barely manage her own finances, let alone understand the complexity of my father's estate. She probably doesn't even know what half those assets are worth. The courtroom fell silent except for Derek's chuckling. Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes when he looked at me. Mrs. Vance, do you have legal representation? I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. No, Your Honor, I'm representing myself. I see. He made a note on his papers. And what is your response to these allegations? My throat felt dry as sandpaper. 20 years of morning coffee and evening wine, of birthday dinners and anniversary celebrations, of holding Marcus's hand through 2 surgeries and countless doctor's appointments. How do you compress a life into legal terminology? Your Honor, I loved my husband. Everything I did was to take care of him, to make him happy. I never asked for his money. I never even wanted it. Derek snorted. Right. That's why you married a man 25 years older than you. I married Marcus because he was kind, I said, my voice growing stronger despite the tremor in my hands. Because he treated me with respect. Because after my first marriage ended, he showed me what real love looked like. Whitmore shuffled through his papers. Your Honor, we can produce witnesses who will testify that Mrs. Vance frequently made comments about inheriting the deceased's wealth. Her own neighbor heard her discussing the will just weeks before his death. Mrs. Chin. My stomach dropped. She'd caught me crying on the front porch after Marcus's diagnosis, when the doctor told us he had maybe 6 months. I'd been terrified, not of losing the money, but of losing him, of being alone again. But how would that sound in a courtroom? Judge Hamilton glanced at his watch. We'll adjourn for today and reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Mrs. Vance, I strongly advise you to consider obtaining legal counsel. As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, watching Derek and Whitmore shake hands and laugh about something I couldn't hear. The weight of the day pressed down on me like a physical force. I'd been dismissed, diminished, reduced to nothing more than a gold-digging housewife in a cheap dress. But as I finally stood to leave, something inside me began to stir. Something that had been sleeping for 20 years, buried beneath casseroles and PTA meetings and anniversary parties. Something that remembered who I used to be before I became Marcus's wife. Derek thought he knew me. Whitmore thought he could destroy me with a few well-placed accusations. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. That evening, I sat in Marcus's study, surrounded by the ghosts of our life together. The walls were lined with law books, his collection from his days as a corporate attorney, and photographs from our travels, Venice, Paris, the cabin in Maine where we spent our last anniversary. Everything felt fragile now, as if Derek's accusations had the power to erase 20 years of happiness. I poured myself a glass of the Merlot Marcus had been saving for a special occasion that never came, and tried to make sense of what had happened in that courtroom. The way Derek had looked at me like I was something dirty he'd stepped in. The way Whitmore had dismissed me as if I were nothing. Just a housewife, I whispered to the empty room, and the words tasted bitter. But I wasn't always just a housewife, was I? My fingers traced the spines of those law books, remembering when I'd had my own collection, when I'd worn power suits instead of aprons, when people stood when I entered a room. That life felt like a dream now, buried so deeply I sometimes wondered if I'd imagined it at all. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. Mrs. Vance, this is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. I understand you're involved in a high-profile inheritance dispute. Would you be willing to comment on the allegations that you manipulated your late husband? I hung up without a word, but the phone rang again immediately, then again. By the fourth call, I disconnected it entirely. Somehow, word had gotten out. Tomorrow, I'd probably see my face on the morning news, portrayed as the wicked stepmother who'd stolen a dying man's fortune. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, and caught sight of myself in the mirror. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, face lined with years of laughter and worry, wearing the same style of modest dress I'd worn for the past 2 decades. I looked exactly like what Derek had called me, just a housewife. But as I opened the jewelry box on my dresser to put away my wedding ring for the night, my fingers found something else. Hidden beneath the velvet lining was a small key I'd forgotten about. The key to Marcus's desk drawer, the one he'd always kept locked. For emergencies, he'd said when he gave it to me years ago, when you need to remember who you really are. I'd never understood what he meant until now. Back in the study, my hands trembling with something between fear and anticipation, I slid the key into the lock. The drawer opened with a soft click, revealing a manila folder marked Elena, personal. Inside were documents I hadn't seen in 20 years. My law degree from Stanford. Summa cum laude. Newspaper clippings from my early career. A photograph of me being sworn in as the youngest Superior Court judge in the state's history. Letters of recommendation from legal giants whose names still carried weight in courtrooms across the country. And at the bottom of the pile, a handwritten note from Marcus. My dearest Elena, I know you sacrificed everything to build a life with me. But your talents were never wasted. They were just sleeping, waiting for the day you'd need them again. You are the strongest, most brilliant woman I've ever known. Don't let anyone, not even our son, convince you otherwise. All my love, Marcus. The tears came then, hot and overwhelming. Marcus had known. He'd always known who I really was, what I'd given up for love, and he'd protected that secret, kept it safe until I was ready to reclaim it. I'd been Judge Elena Vance for 15 years before I became Mrs. Marcus Vance. I'd presided over complex civil cases, corporate litigation, criminal trials that made headlines. I'd earned a reputation as the Iron Judge, brilliant, incorruptible, feared by lawyers who came unprepared to my courtroom. But when I met Marcus at a charity gala in 2003, something shifted. He was recently widowed, struggling to raise 12-year-old Derek alone. He didn't know who I was professionally. To him, I was just Elena, the woman who made him laugh for the first time since his wife's death. For the first time in my career, I'd found something more important than the law. A man who loved me for who I was, not what I'd achieved. A broken family that needed healing. A chance to be someone's wife, maybe even someone's mother. So I'd made a choice. I took early retirement, citing burnout, and quietly stepped away from the legal world that had defined me for so long. I became Mrs. Marcus Vance, stepmother to a grieving boy who resented my presence, but desperately needed stability. 20 years of PTA meetings and school plays and family dinners. 20 years of being the woman behind the successful man, supporting Marcus's career while mine became a footnote in legal journals. I told myself it was worth it, that love was worth any sacrifice. But as I sat in that study, surrounded by the evidence of who I used to be, I realized something had been burning inside me all day. Not just anger at Derek's accusations, but something fiercer, something that remembered what it felt like to command a courtroom, to make lawyers twice my age scramble for precedents they couldn't find. I pulled out my laptop. Marcus had insisted I learn to use it, though I'd mostly stuck to email and online shopping, and did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I researched case law, inheritance disputes, undue influence, burden of proof. My fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory I didn't know I still possessed, navigating legal databases like I'd never left. The law had changed in some ways over the past 2 decades, but the fundamentals remained the same. And Derek's case, it was weaker than tissue paper. Whitmore was relying on emotional manipulation and circumstantial evidence. He had no proof of coercion, no documentation of diminished capacity, no witnesses to any actual wrongdoing. What he had was a grieving son's resentment and a jury's potential sympathy for a young man who felt cheated out of his inheritance. But sympathy doesn't win cases. Evidence does. And I was beginning to remember exactly how to find it. I spent the rest of the night in that study, reading through Marcus's papers with eyes that hadn't seen them in 20 years. Not as a wife, but as a lawyer. The will was ironclad, witnessed, and notarized properly. Marcus's medical records showed no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. His financial advisor had detailed notes about their discussions regarding the inheritance, including Marcus's specific concerns about Derek's spending habits and lack of responsibility. More importantly, I found Marcus's private journal from his final months. Page after page of entries expressing his love for me, his gratitude for our life together, and his growing disappointment in Derek's behavior. The last entry, dated just a week before his death, made me catch my breath. Elena doesn't know I've seen her old courtroom photos hidden in that box in the closet. She thinks she gave up everything for me, but she has no idea how proud I am of what she accomplished. If anything happens to me, I know Derek will try to hurt her. He's never forgiven her for taking his mother's place in my heart. But my Elena is stronger than she knows. She's forgotten what she's capable of, but I haven't. She's going to surprise everyone. I closed the journal and looked around the study with new eyes. This wasn't just Marcus's space. It had been mine, too, long before I'd ever met him. And tomorrow, when I walked back into that courtroom, I wouldn't be walking in as just a housewife. I would be walking in as Judge Elena Vance. Derek thought he could intimidate me with his expensive lawyer and his accusations. He thought I was nothing more than the woman who'd cooked his dinner and washed his clothes for 20 years. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been about everything. The second day in court arrived with a crispness that matched my newfound resolve. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing the same navy dress from the day before, but this time I carried myself differently. My spine was straighter, my steps more measured. I was still playing the role of the grieving housewife, but underneath something had awakened. Derek and Whitmore were already at their table when I arrived, deep in conversation over stacks of papers. Whitmore looked confident, almost bored, like a man who'd already won. Derek wore that same smirk, occasionally glancing my way as if I were an amusing sideshow. Judge Morrison entered promptly at 9 o'clock, and I noticed something I'd missed yesterday. The way he carried himself, the careful precision of his movements. He reminded me of the young attorneys who used to appear in my courtroom, the ones who'd studied every case precedent and still trembled when they stood to speak. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Morrison said, "you may call your first witness." "Thank you, Your Honor." "I'd like to call Mrs. Elizabeth Chin to the stand." My stomach clenched as my neighbor took the oath. Mrs. Chin had lived next door for 8 years, always polite but distant. I'd helped her with groceries after her hip surgery, brought her soup when she had the flu. But as she settled into the witness chair, she wouldn't meet my eyes. Whitmore approached her with the practiced ease of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Mrs. Chin, how well did you know the deceased Marcus Vance?" "Pretty well. He was a good neighbor, very kind." "And his relationship with his son Derek?" Mrs. Chin shifted uncomfortably. "Well, I didn't see Derek visit very often in the last few years." "Did Mrs. Vance ever discuss this with you?" "Sometimes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. She seemed frustrated by it. Whitmore nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell the court about a specific conversation you had with Mrs. Vance regarding the inheritance?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew what was coming. It was about 2 months before Marcus died. I found her crying on her front porch. She was upset about his diagnosis, the cancer, you know. And she said, Mrs. Chin paused, glancing at me with what looked like guilt. She said she was scared of what would happen to her when he was gone, that she'd given up everything for him, and Derek would probably try to take it all away from her. The courtroom was dead silent. Whitmore let the words hang in the air like smoke. Did she mention the will specifically? She said Marcus had promised to take care of her, but she was worried Derek wouldn't honor that promise. Whitmore smiled. No further questions. Judge Morrison looked at me. Mrs. Vance, do you wish to cross-examine the witness? I stood slowly, my legs steadier than they'd been yesterday. Something was stirring in my chest. Not panic, but calculation. Yes, Your Honor. I approached Mrs. Chin, noting how she flinched slightly. Poor woman. She had no idea she was about to become my first piece of evidence that things weren't what they seemed. Mrs. Chin, you testified that I was crying on my porch when we had this conversation. Can you tell the court why I was crying? She blinked, clearly not expecting this question. Because Marcus was dying. Specifically, what had I just learned that day? Whitmore started to object, but Judge Morrison waved him off. I'll allow it. Mrs. Chin looked confused. The doctor had told you both that morning that the treatments weren't working, that he had maybe 6 weeks left. 6 weeks, I repeated, letting the words settle. Mrs. Chin, in your opinion, was I crying because my husband was dying or because I was worried about money? Because he was dying, she said immediately, then looked stricken as she realized what she'd admitted. And when I mentioned being scared of what would happen when he was gone, did I say I was scared of being poor, or did I say I was scared of being alone? Mrs. Chen's voice was barely audible. You said you were scared of being alone, that you didn't know how to live without him. I nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. No further questions. As she left the witness stand, I caught Judge Morrison watching me with renewed interest. There had been something in my questioning, a precision, a control, that didn't match the image of a helpless housewife. Whitmore called 2 more witnesses. Marcus's banker, who testified about the large sums of money Marcus had moved around in his final months, and a former colleague who claimed Marcus had seemed confused during their last conversation. But with each witness, I grew more confident. The banker admitted under my cross-examination that Marcus had been reorganizing his finances to make them easier for me to manage after his death, a thoughtful gesture, not evidence of manipulation. The colleague conceded that Marcus's confusion was actually frustration with his former law firm's handling of a client's case. By lunch break, I could see doubt creeping into Whitmore's expression. Derek, however, remained smugly confident. Your Honor, Judge Morrison said quietly as we prepared to recess, I have to ask. Mrs. Vance, what's your full legal name? The question hit me like electricity. I'm sorry, Your Honor? For the court records. Your full legal name. My mouth went dry. This was it. The moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. Elena Vance, Your Honor. But I go by Lena. Judge Morrison's pen froze over his notepad. His eyes snapped up to mine, and I saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Elena Vance, he repeated slowly. As in, Judge Elena Vance. The courtroom went deadly silent. Derek's head whipped around to stare at me. Whitmore's confident expression cracked like thin ice. I was Judge Elena Vance, I said quietly. I retired 20 years ago. What? Derek shot to his feet. That's impossible. You're just a housewife. I finished for him. Yes, I heard you yesterday. Whitmore was frantically whispering to Derek, both of them looking like they'd seen a ghost. Judge Morrison was staring at me with something approaching awe. Your Honor, Whitmore said, his voice strained. This is the first we're hearing of any legal background. We request time to what? Judge Morrison's voice was sharp. To research the woman you've been calling an uneducated gold digger? Mr. Whitmore, did you not investigate the background of the opposing party? Whitmore's face had gone pale. We conducted standard background checks, Your Honor. There was no indication of any legal career. Because I took my husband's name and retired from public life, I said simply. But my bar membership is still active. I've kept up with continuing education requirements. I am in fact qualified to represent myself in this matter. I approached Mrs. Chin, noting how she flinched slightly. Poor woman. She had no idea she was about to become my first piece of evidence that things weren't what they seemed. Mrs. Chin, you testified that I was crying on my porch when we had this conversation. Can you tell the court why I was crying? She blinked, clearly not expecting this question. Because Marcus was dying. Specifically, what had I just learned that day? Whitmore started to object, but Judge Morrison waved him off. I'll allow it. Mrs. Chin looked confused. The doctor had told you both that morning that the treatments weren't working, that he had maybe 6 weeks left. 6 weeks, I repeated, letting the words settle. Mrs. Chin, in your opinion, was I crying because my husband was dying or because I was worried about money? Because he was dying, she said immediately, then looked stricken as she realized what she'd admitted. And when I mentioned being scared of what would happen when he was gone, did I say I was scared of being poor, or did I say I was scared of being alone? Mrs. Chen's voice was barely audible. You said you were scared of being alone, that you didn't know how to live without him. I nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. No further questions. As she left the witness stand, I caught Judge Morrison watching me with renewed interest. There had been something in my questioning, a precision, a control, that didn't match the image of a helpless housewife. Whitmore called 2 more witnesses. Marcus's banker, who testified about the large sums of money Marcus had moved around in his final months, and a former colleague who claimed Marcus had seemed confused during their last conversation. But with each witness, I grew more confident. The banker admitted under my cross-examination that Marcus had been reorganizing his finances to make them easier for me to manage after his death, a thoughtful gesture, not evidence of manipulation. The weight of what was happening began to settle over the courtroom. Derek looked like he was about to be sick. Whitmore was shuffling through papers, as if he could find some magic solution to the disaster unfolding before him. But Judge Morrison was looking at me with the kind of respect I hadn't seen in 20 years. Judge Vance, he said formally. I had the honor of appearing before your court several times as a young attorney. You were formidable. A small smile tugged at my lips. I tried to be fair, Your Honor. You were both fair and brilliant. He turned to Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you use the lunch recess to reconsider your strategy. Court will reconvene at 2 o'clock. As the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, feeling the transformation that was taking place inside me. The mask I'd worn for 20 years was beginning to slip, and underneath, Judge Elena Vance was waking up. Derek approached my table, his face twisted with rage and confusion. This is impossible. You can't be a judge. Judges don't just become housewives. I looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time in years. Not as a stepmother, not as the woman who'd tried so hard to earn his love, but as the judge who'd spent 15 years sizing up liars and manipulators. Some of us, I said quietly, choose love over power, Derek. But that doesn't mean we forget how to fight when we need to. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Behind him, Whitmore was making frantic phone calls, probably trying to figure out how badly they'd just miscalculated. As I gathered my things to leave for lunch, I felt lighter than I had in months. The grief was still there. I would always miss Marcus, but underneath it was something I'd thought was gone forever. The thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of watching a weak case crumble under scrutiny. Judge Elena Vance was back, and she was ready for war. The afternoon session felt different from the moment I walked back into that courtroom. Word had spread during the lunch break. I could see it in the way people looked at me, in the hushed conversations that stopped when I passed. The local legal community was small, and apparently the return of Judge Elena Vance was news. Derek sat slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. Whitmore kept glancing at me with the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd brought a knife to a gunfight. But it was Judge Morrison's demeanor that had changed most dramatically. Where yesterday he'd looked at me with polite sympathy, now there was something approaching deference in his eyes. Before we proceed, Judge Morrison said once court was in session, I want to address the elephant in the room. Yesterday, we learned that Mrs. Vance is actually retired Superior Court Judge Elena Vance, known throughout the legal community for her brilliant jurisprudence and uncompromising integrity. Mr. Whitmore, do you wish to make any motions before we proceed? Whitmore stood slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something resembling humility. Your Honor, we move to dismiss all charges of manipulation and undue influence. We acknowledge that we may have been overzealous in our initial assessment of Mrs. Vance's character and capabilities. A cold smile tugged at my lips. 24 hours ago, this would have been victory enough. But something had changed during the long night I'd spent preparing for this moment. This wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. It was about justice for every woman who'd ever been dismissed, diminished, or called just a housewife. I stood before Whitmore could sit down. Your Honor, I object to the dismissal. Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Vance, the plaintiff is attempting to withdraw their case in your favor. You're objecting to winning. I'm objecting to settling for less than the full truth, Your Honor. Mr. Whitmore and his client have made serious allegations about my character, my competence, and my fitness to inherit my late husband's estate. I believe this court and the public record deserves to hear all the evidence before we conclude these proceedings. I could see understanding dawning in Judge Morrison's eyes. He'd been a young attorney when I was on the bench, and he remembered my reputation for thorough, uncompromising justice. Very well, he said. Mrs. Vance, you may present your case. I had spent the entire night preparing for this moment, and I was ready. Your Honor, I call Marcus Vance to testify. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Whitmore shot to his feet. Objection. The witness is deceased. Not Marcus Vance himself, Mr. Whitmore. Marcus Vance's voice preserved in video testimony he recorded 3 months before his death, specifically in case his will was ever contested. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek's face went white as I approached the bailiff with a tablet containing the video file I'd found hidden in Marcus's computer files the night before. Your Honor, I said, my husband was a meticulous man who understood human nature better than most. He knew that his son might challenge this will, and he wanted his own voice to speak from beyond the grave. The courtroom's attention focused on the large screen as Marcus's face appeared, gaunt from his illness, but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and determination. My name is Marcus Vance, his recorded voice began, and I am of sound mind and body as I record this on March 15, 2024. I am creating this testimony because I fear that after my death, my son Derek will attempt to contest my will and vilify my beloved wife Elena in the process. Derek slumped in his chair as his father's voice filled the courtroom with an authority that death couldn't diminish. Marcus's voice softened slightly. Derek, I pray that someday you'll understand that your anger toward Elena was never really about her. It was about losing your mother and being afraid to let anyone else love you. But that's not Elena's fault, and it's not her responsibility to pay for your inability to heal. The video ended, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. I could see jurors wiping their eyes, court reporters looking shaken, even the bailiff standing a little straighter out of respect for what they'd just witnessed. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. Mr. Whitmore, do you wish to cross-examine this testimony? Whitmore looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 20 minutes. No, Your Honor. No questions. Mrs. Vance, do you have additional evidence to present? I moved to my table and lifted a thick folder I'd compiled during my sleepless night. Yes, Your Honor. I have documentation showing that Derek Vance has borrowed approximately $156,000 from his father over the past 15 years, none of which has been repaid. I have records showing that he was asked to leave 3 different jobs for excessive absences and unprofessional conduct. And I have witnesses who can testify to his pattern of appearing at his father's home only when he needed money. I paused, letting the weight of evidence settle over the courtroom like dust after an explosion. But more importantly, Your Honor, I have this. I held up Marcus's private journal, the one I'd found in his locked drawer. My husband's personal thoughts and feelings about his relationship with his son, recorded over the final year of his life. Thoughts that show not manipulation, but heartbreak. Not undue influence, but a father's desperate hope that his son would someday grow into the man he'd raised him to be. Derek was openly sobbing now, his whole body shaking with the force of his grief and shame. Your Honor, I said, my voice carrying the authority of both my legal training and my personal pain, this case was never about money. It was about a young man who couldn't accept that his father loved his stepmother, not instead of him, but alongside him. It was about grief turned to greed and entitlement masquerading as injustice. I turned to face Derek directly. I tried to love you for 20 years, Derek. I failed, but not for lack of trying. Your father left me his estate because he knew I would honor his memory and protect what he built. You're challenging that not because you were wronged, but because you feel wronged, and there's a difference. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Vance, what are you asking this court to do? I took a deep breath, feeling the full weight of my professional authority settling around me like armor. I'm asking this court to uphold Marcus Vance's will in its entirety. I'm asking for a judgment that removes any cloud from my inheritance. And I'm asking that Derek Vance be ordered to repay the $156,000 he borrowed from his father's estate over the years, with appropriate interest. The gasp that went up from the courtroom was audible. Whitmore shot to his feet. Your Honor, that's not part of this case. It is now, I said calmly. Derek opened this door when he claimed I was financially exploiting his father. I'm simply asking for an accounting of all financial exploitation that occurred in this family. Judge Morrison looked at Derek with something approaching pity. Mr. Vance, how do you respond to these allegations? Derek could barely speak through his tears. I don't have that kind of money. I can't pay it back. Then perhaps, I said quietly, you shouldn't have borrowed it in the first place. The silence that followed felt like the end of the world. And in many ways, it was the end of Derek's world of entitlement and denial, the end of his fantasy that he was the wronged party in this family story. Judge Morrison spent several minutes reviewing his notes before he spoke. When he finally looked up, his expression was grave. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, you've heard extraordinary testimony today, but based on the evidence presented, I'm prepared to issue a directed verdict in this matter. He turned to Derek and Whitmore with the kind of stern authority that had once made me proud to be part of the legal profession. The allegations of undue influence and manipulation are not only unfounded, they are insulting to the memory of Marcus Vance and deeply harmful to his widow's reputation. Mrs. Vance has proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that she is not only competent to inherit her husband's estate, but deserving of it through 2 decades of devotion and sacrifice. His gaze shifted to me, and I saw respect there, the kind of respect one legal professional shows another. Furthermore, the evidence of financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation on the part of Derek Vance is overwhelming. I find in favor of Mrs. Vance on all counts, and I order Derek Vance to repay the $156,000 in loans, plus interest calculated at the current federal rate. Derek's world was ending, but mine was just beginning again. Judge Elena Vance was back, and justice had been served. 6 months after the trial, I stood in my new law office, looking out at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The brass nameplate on my door read Elena Vance, attorney at law. It felt right in a way nothing had felt right in 20 years. The inheritance case had made headlines throughout the legal community, not just for the dramatic courtroom revelation, but for what happened afterward. Within weeks of the verdict, I'd received dozens of calls from women in similar situations, widows whose stepchildren were contesting wills, wives whose families dismissed them as just housewives, women who'd sacrificed careers for love and found themselves fighting for respect in their later years. I'd started taking cases again, slowly at first. Pro bono work for women who couldn't afford the kind of high-powered attorneys their opponents could hire. Word spread quickly through the community that Judge Elena Vance was back, and she was fighting for the underestimated and overlooked. My secretary knocked gently on the door. Mrs. Vance, your 3 o'clock appointment is here. Send her in, please. The woman who entered was in her early 60s, well-dressed but nervous, clutching her purse like a shield. I recognized the look immediately. It was the same expression I'd worn walking into that courtroom 6 months ago. Mrs. Morrison, please have a seat. She settled into the chair across from my desk, her hands trembling slightly. I'm not sure you can help me, Mrs. Vance. My situation is complicated. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. Mrs. Morrison, I've learned that the most complicated situations often have the simplest solutions. Tell me what's happening. My husband died 3 months ago. We were married for 18 years. His second marriage, my first. His children from his first marriage are claiming I brainwashed him into changing his will. They're saying I'm just a gold digger who married an older man for his money. The familiar story settled over me like an old song I'd heard too many times. And what's the truth? She looked up at me with eyes full of pain. The truth is that I gave up my nursing career when his first wife died and he needed help raising his teenage daughters. I spent 15 years trying to be a mother to girls who hated me for not being their biological mother. I nursed him through diabetes, through heart surgery, through depression after his business failed. And now they want to paint me as some kind of predator. I nodded, making notes on a yellow legal pad. Do you have documentation of your contributions to the household? Financial records, medical records, anything that shows your involvement in his care. I kept everything. Receipts, medical appointments, bank statements showing my nursing salary going toward household expenses. I even have letters he wrote to me about how grateful he was for my sacrifices. I smiled, feeling the familiar thrill of a winnable case. Mrs. Morrison, I think we're going to get along very well. As she left an hour later, armed with a legal strategy and renewed confidence, I reflected on how much my life had changed. The grief over Marcus's death was still there. It probably always would be, but it no longer defined me. I'd found purpose again, a reason to get up each morning that went beyond just surviving. My phone buzzed with a text message. The caller ID made my stomach tighten. Derek, can we talk? I've been thinking about what you said in court. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. Coffee. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Brewers on 5th Street. The next morning, I arrived at the coffee shop early and chose a table near the window where I could watch for Derek's approach. When he finally appeared, I was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the arrogant swagger, the expensive suit, the smirk that had infuriated me for 20 years. He looked older, humbled, like a man who'd been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. He spotted me and approached hesitantly, as if unsure of his welcome. Elena. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I gestured to the chair across from me. Sit down, Derek. He ordered coffee, and we sat in uncomfortable silence until it arrived. Finally, he cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. More than an apology. I owe you. I don't know what I owe you. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or ulterior motive. What I saw instead was genuine remorse and something I'd never seen from him before. Humility. You don't owe me anything, Derek. Your father already paid all the debts that mattered. He winced. That video he made. Watching it, hearing him talk about me like that, it was like seeing myself through someone else's eyes for the first time. And what did you see? He stared into his coffee cup. A spoiled, entitled brat who threw away 20 years of trying to earn love I never deserved in the first place. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something softer than the anger I'd carried for so long. Derek, you were 12 years old when I married your father. 12-year-olds don't know how to process grief or how to make room for new people in their hearts. I never expected you to love me immediately, but I never stopped trying to show you that you were worthy of love. You were a child, Derek. You weren't supposed to know how to love like that yet. But I'm not a child anymore. And if there's any chance at all, that we could figure out how to be a family, even this late, even after everything I've done, I'd like to try. I looked at this man who'd been my stepson for 20 years, but had never really been my family. And I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine vulnerability. A genuine desire to change. It would take time, I said carefully. There's a lot of hurt to work through. I have time. And if you're willing, I'd like to start with getting to know the woman who was important enough for my father to change his entire will to protect. I stood to leave, slinging my purse over my shoulder. At the door, I turned back. Derek, your father loved you. He never stopped loving you. Not even when he was disappointed in you. I hope you know that. His eyes filled with tears. I'm starting to. 6 months later, I stood in the same courtroom where everything had changed. This time representing a 72-year-old woman whose stepchildren were trying to have her declared incompetent. The opposing counsel was young, cocky, clearly believing this would be an easy victory against an elderly widow. They had no idea who they were dealing with. As I rose to deliver my opening statement, I felt the full weight of my authority, my experience, and my purpose settle around me like armor. I was Judge Elena Vance, attorney at law, protector of the underestimated and defender of the dismissed. And I was exactly where I belonged. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I began, my voice carrying the confidence of a woman who'd found her way back to herself. This case is about more than an inheritance. It's about a society that assumes a woman's worth diminishes with age, that believes a widow's grief makes her an easy target for exploitation. I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the courtroom. Today, we're going to prove them wrong. Behind me in the gallery sat Mrs. Morrison, whose case I'd won 3 months earlier. Next to her was Mrs. Chin, the neighbor who testified against me but had later become one of my strongest advocates. And in the back row, wearing a simple suit and looking nervous but proud, sat Derek. My family. Not the one I'd been born into or married into, but the one I'd built through battle, through loss, through the decision to stop hiding who I really was. The phoenix had risen from the ashes, and she was ready to fight. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you.